Hello, I'm Jean Pete, and I welcome you back to our show, Better Living. Better Living is brought to you by the Homestead Hope Foundation and is sponsored by Homestead Hospice, where commitment to education and premier hospice care helps patients and families through life's most important journey. Thank you for joining me again today. Today I'm here with Leslie Gregory, who is the president and CEO of the Georgia chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. So we have a very important and serious topic to discuss today with all of the latest and greatest news. And if you are somebody who is either caring for someone with a dementia diagnosis or just received a dementia diagnosis, there's a lot of great information coming your way today thanks to Leslie. So Leslie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Leslie's a past guest. We met a couple years ago. You were on this show, is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
So a lot's happened in a few years.
Yes, the world of Alzheimer's is literally changing practically on a daily basis. We're learning more about it every day.
So let's back up for just a minute for those listeners that are hearing you for the first time. First of all, let's talk about what is Alzheimer's?
Yes, Alzheimer's is the single most commonly diagnosed form of dementia. The way we like to describe it is that dementia is an umbrella, and underneath are the various types, and Alzheimer's is the most common type. It's not normal aging. It's not normal memory loss. It is a progressive disease of the brain that destroys brain cells and ultimately results in loss of memory, decision-making, and even day-to-day functioning.
And but is Alzheimer's the most prevalent? Did you hear the Boston accent come out just then? I must be tired this morning.
Have you heard my Mississippi accent come out yet?
So Alzheimer's, we'll pronounce the R that time. Is that the most prevalent diagnosis under the dementia umbrella?
Yes, Alzheimer's is the most prevalent type of dementia.
Okay. And when typically do we, I know this is a loaded question, but is there a typical age span that people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's?
Actually, that's a really good question. We know that if you're 85 or older, your odds of having Alzheimer's are 1 in 2.
My gosh.
Yes. If you're 65 or older, the odds are 1 in 8, which is very significant because now the baby boomers are 65 and older. And there are 10,000 people, 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 years old every day. And now 1 in 8 of those people are at risk. But it's not just an older person's disease. We're seeing more and more of what we call younger onset Alzheimer's disease, and that's when it's diagnosed before the age of 65.
Okay, so that's scary. Since you were here the last time, those stats have changed, I think. I don't recall 1 in 2, 85 years and older. So if we grow to be 85, likelihood is we're going to get Alzheimer's.
There's a very strong possibility, yes. And part of that may be because we're living longer. We're getting a better grasp on some of the other diseases because we've funded research. We know more about how to prevent heart disease, stroke, diabetes, those things.
True.
So we're living longer, which means more people are now at risk for the disease.
And, you know, when you were here the last time, I don't think you could, I think I'm remembering this correctly, we couldn't correctly diagnose a dementia until someone had died. Is that right? So just recently, there has been new advances that help people diagnose this disease while folks are still living?
Absolutely. We find now that people can get an accurate and timely diagnosis. And the interesting thing about that is by the time you see symptoms, you're well into the disease because we know that changes are happening in the brain as much as 20 years before you see the first symptom.
Holy cow.
So let's say your mom starts showing signs at 70. Well, when she was 50, there were changes already happening in her brain.
Okay, that's scary.
That is scary. Yes.
So this 1 in 2, maybe because we have now the technology to diagnose, that is probably another leading factor for why the stats have gotten so scary.
Sure, and we've identified some things like biomarkers that are indicators of the disease. For example, we know that a classic hallmark of Alzheimer's disease are two kinds of proteins. One forms plaques in the brain and one forms tangles in the brain. But basically, these two proteins are indicators of the disease. And now we have ways of identifying when those proteins are present.
Okay, because there's my next question, which probably everybody who gets a diagnosis or who's ever had experience with a loved one with dementia, some form of dementia, asks you, but there's no way to prevent. Do we know how we could prevent this plaque or tangle from building up in our brain?
You know, Alzheimer's, it's really disturbing because it's the sixth leading cause of death in our country. And if you look at the other diseases in the top 10, we know how to prevent many of them. We know how to treat some of them. We have cures for some of them. For Alzheimer's disease, it's the only one of the top 10 that there's no way of preventing it. There's no treatment.
Yet.
There's no cure. It's changing dramatically. We do know there are some things that you can do, some lifestyle changes that you can implement in your life that can help delay the onset of symptoms or slow down the progression of the symptoms. They're certainly not going to stop the disease. We don't know anything that can stop it. We don't know anything that can cure it. But you might be able to delay the onset of those symptoms by implementing some lifestyle changes.
And what's that?
Well, what we tell people is know your numbers. Anything that's healthy for your heart is also healthy for your brain. So manage your cholesterol, manage your blood pressure, manage your weight. All those things you do for a healthy heart also contribute to having a healthy brain. And we tell people exercise is critical. Studies have shown that time and time again. Exercise is really important. Not only staying physically active, though, but also staying socially and mentally active can help slow down the progression or delay the onset slightly.
And because I think, every show I do that has to do with any disease, almost anything, it all comes back to the same thing. Take care of this vessel that we've been given, which is our body, and move your body and get the blood flowing and get the oxygen flowing. And that can only help maybe wash away, I'm just trying to give a visual, some of that plaque that would be building up if you didn't have that nice flow in there pushing that plaque away.
Absolutely. And we know, too, that like a Mediterranean diet, that has a role in slowing down the progression as well. So eating right, getting plenty of sleep. This is one thing I find interesting because I am an insomniac. I struggle with that. But we're seeing more and more studies that show that there's a component of sleep affecting dementia, that those who don't sleep might be more likely. We don't know exactly why. I was reading a study recently that showed that when you're in the deepest sleep, it's like your brain uses that time to wash things out of your brain and possibly wash the protein out. Granted, that's just one study. But it is showing some possible indication that there is a link between not getting enough sleep and having dementia down the road.
Now, let me ask you this, and I don't know if you know it. I'm just thinking and curious as you're talking. But, we hear about our heart and we hear about plaque buildup in our arteries. Is that the same plaque that's building up in our brain, or is it different? Because you would think that if we can come up with some meds to help us with our heart, why can't we come up with meds to help us with our brain?
Well, and that is the goal, but it is a different kind of plaque. The plaques that are associated with Alzheimer's disease are composed of a protein called beta amyloid. And there's that other protein called tau, and it makes up the tangles. And basically, one of these proteins causes the brain cells to die. The other one prevents communication between the nerve cells. Okay. So a little bit different than the plaques you would have that might contribute to heart disease.
Okay.
But as you said, we have medications now that can help with preventing heart disease. The hope is that eventually we'll have something like that for Alzheimer's disease.
I hope so. I hope in a couple years when I have you back, we have some major news to tell everybody.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the early signs. It can take 20 years before you really start to see the symptoms, as you said earlier. But with people living together and maybe having some slight concerns in the back of their mind about their loved one that they're living with, how can we help them identify okay, this is something I really need to see the doctor about?
That is a great question. And that's one thing I have people ask me a lot is they'll say, oh, I lose my keys. Does this mean I have dementia? Well, if you're just losing your keys, we all do that. In all likelihood, you've just got too much on your mind and you're forgetful. But if you go to our website on alz.org, there's a link you can click to the 10 early warning signs. And it tells you what some of those signs are, and more importantly, or as importantly, it tells you what are not signs. And let me give you some examples. One early warning sign is losing something and then not being able to retrace your steps to find it. I mentioned earlier the example of losing keys. If you occasionally lose your keys, that's not a sign. But if you lose something and then you can't later retrace your steps and find it, or if you find it in an odd place, say example, the remote control in the freezer, if you find it in an odd location, that might be a sign. Memory loss that affects daily living, that's a sign as well. Not just forgetting a person's name, but problems with language and word usage might be. Using inappropriate words or not being able to grasp the correct word, that might be a sign. Confusion as to time and place. We all get lost from time to time. Mm-hmm. That's not an indication. But if you get lost and then you don't remember how you got there, that could certainly be a sign. Okay. Not being able to do something that you've done repeatedly throughout your life. Let's say your mother has always made the same meatloaf recipe every Wednesday night, and she goes to make it on Wednesday night, and she doesn't remember that you use ground beef to make the meatloaf. This is something she's done repeatedly. It's an activity that's familiar to her, and suddenly she can't remember it.
Okay.
The having lapses in judgment might be one as well. One sign we see is people making poor financial decisions.
I've heard that. All of a sudden, they start gambling.
Yes, or sending money to telemarketers, and they've never done that before.
Some big boat that would be completely out of the ordinary.
Yes, or let's say you notice your mom is having trouble paying her bills. She's paid the light bill twice and hasn't paid her rent at all that month. That's very, very indicative of an early sign.
I have that problem sometimes. Pay the DirecTV 2 times, forget to pay the electric bill. If I'm in that 20-year span, you're getting me a little worried here, Leslie. Is there on that note, though, seriously, I don't think I have dementia, but, we do lead busy lives. Yes. And life does get crazy. I think we fill our brains too much, and they go into overload. And so you had mentioned there are some things that are not signs.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of those.
Okay, I mentioned, getting lost and being unable to retrace your steps. The other day I was coming home from work, and I had so much on my mind, I blew right past my exit. I turned around, I went back, I blew right past it again. Well, does this mean I have dementia? No.
Okay,
no.
You're making me feel better.
I just had a lot on my mind at the time. I wasn't focusing. I wasn't concentrating. I haven't lost the ability to do things that I would normally do. I haven't lost my ability to make sound decisions.
Okay.
So big difference.
Okay.
Big difference between maybe just having your brain overloaded and getting a little careless. Mm-hmm. And not being able to perform normal functions.
Okay, so let's talk about that person that is concerned about themselves or their loved one is noticing that there's a change, maybe some of these things that you're talking about. Make an appointment with your primary caregiver. What do you recommend? Do you stay with the primary caregiver? Do you ask for an expert neurologist to see you? How does that all work?
That's really hard to say because it depends on the primary care physician. But we do encourage people, if there's any question, go get a diagnosis. They can call our 1-800 number and we can provide them, they give us their zip code and we can provide them with a list of neurologists in their area, a list of physicians who specialize in this. We're not going to recommend one physician over another,
right,
but we'll tell you who's in your area that is a specialist in this, and then we'll encourage you to go to the doctor. And if it's your loved one that you're concerned about, we encourage you to go with them, because one thing we see, especially very early on in the disease, is that people who have the disease can mask the symptoms. They can hide it very well. They can compensate with note-taking and just picking up on verbal cues when they see someone react when they've repeated themselves. They learn how to compensate. So if you have questions or concerns about your loved one, go with them to the doctor and share with them what you see, because what they show the doctor may not be what you see at home.
Mm-hmm. And maybe people can't do that in front of their loved one when they're at the doctor. So maybe even write it down.
Absolutely. Or have a private conversation.
Give it to the receptionist to say, can you give this to the doctor before we go in?
Absolutely. And that diagnosis is so important. One thing I run into is when I'm talking about the fact that there is no treatment or a cure, people will often say, well, if I had the disease, I wouldn't want to know. And my answer to that is knowledge is power. Mm-hmm. So we tell people, get that diagnosis, because then you can participate in making decisions that down the road you will not have the ability to make. And those are important decisions like your care, who will care for you, financial decisions, legal decisions. All those things are critical. And as the disease progresses, the person loses the ability to participate in those decisions. So by getting the diagnosis early on, they're empowered to make those decisions, make their wishes known. And also, too, because the medications that are out there work best when started early on in the progression of the disease. And there's also the opportunity to participate in clinical trials. And you never know, you might be part of finding a cure for this disease.
Okay, there was a lot in what you just said. So I want to dissect it for just a minute. I am of, and I think I said this the last time, I am in the camp where the day the doctor gives you the dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever form of dementia diagnosis you have, is the day the doctor should also say, now what you need to do is go see a financial planner today or this week or this month, because there is a lot to this long-term disease, and you want to protect what you've worked your whole life for. And I don't think there's enough of that happening. And so if you or a loved one are recently diagnosed, please, please, please go see a financial planner and get your assets, your estate in order, because there's a look back. And we hope this doesn't happen, but it is a long-term debilitating disease. So towards the end, it may be that a facility is the right choice for you and your family to keep you safe. And if that is what comes down the road, you want to make sure that you don't have to spend down all the money you've earned for your whole entire life before you can get placed into that facility and get some government help. So please, that's very, very important.
Absolutely. What you just said is critical. And it's our hope, we're working through a program, a physician outreach program that we have. It's our hope that when they get the diagnosis, the physician would give them an Alzheimer's Association brochure and say, call these people. And that's one of the very first things that we would tell them. And let me give you a very personal example of that. My mother-in-law was diagnosed in November of last year. And as soon as my husband called and told me that they had gotten the diagnosis, I immediately made an appointment with one of our care consultants on staff, brought him in the office. We developed a plan of things we needed to do. One of the top things on the list was the financial planning piece. And the Alzheimer's Association has educational classes, and one of them is on financial planning for persons with dementia.
Excellent. Good.
So I enrolled both of us in that class. We went to the class. It was, I think it's a couple of hours, maybe 3-hour-long class, and walked away with a plan, immediately contacted an elder law attorney, started the financial planning, and now I have the security of knowing that my mother-in-law and my father-in-law are protected.
That's
so
excellent. Very good.
Very important.
So again, www.alz.org.
Yes.
And that has all the resources you need. And there's also an 800 number if you want to contact Alzheimer's Association. Is this the 800 number for the Georgia chapter, or is this the 800 number for the National Alzheimer's Association?
Actually, it's both.
Okay.
If you call the number, it isn't a number that rings to the National Association, but they can put you in touch with local folks as well.
Perfect.
So that's just kind of the entry point.
Okay. And that number is 800-272-3900. That's 800-272-3900. And again, the website's www.alz.org. alzheimers.org. And if you're in Georgia, it's just /Georgia. So if you're in Arizona, /Arizona, or whatever state you're in.
Or you can just go to alz.org and it has a map of the
Perfect.
U.S. and you can just click on your state.
Okay, great. Yes. So then going back to what I said I wanted to dissect about everything that you were saying, the second thing was the importance of getting that early diagnosis, not just so you can get your affairs in order, but the meds that we have available today now can help prolong the worsening of the symptoms, correct? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yes, they can help slow down the symptoms. They're certainly not going to stop them, but they can help slow them down. But they work best when started in the early course of the disease, which is why it's so important to get that diagnosis, because you want to get those medications on board as soon as possible.
And so let's talk about the progression of the disease, if you would. Are we talking 3 stages? Are we talking 7 stages? Let's kind of give education about what this all means.
Well, there are 7 stages, and a lot of times people will ask me, what is a typical time span that you can expect this disease to cover? And the reality is, if you know one person with Alzheimer's disease, you know one person with Alzheimer's disease. It can be different for everyone. I think it typically might run 7 to 12 years. But there are some cases where it advances much more quickly, and we see that typically in younger onset. It tends to develop and advance more rapidly than it does in later onset, but it's individual. You can't really say, how long your mom is going to be able to, stay home or take care of herself or, even feed herself. There's no concrete answer to that.
Okay, so there's no stats on maybe what the typical progression of, and I don't know, so the answer could be no, there's not, of the disease in this phase, early, mid, late, whatever, however we want to simplify it, versus now these new meds that we have that are breakthrough, now typical range of length of phase is X.
If there are, I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
Simply because the disease is so variable from one person to another. I'm sure if you looked at a study of a certain number of cases out there, you could come up with a range, but would that apply to the other cases that are out there?
Okay.
Not necessarily.
Okay. So really it is individualized, which is another reason why you may want to see a neurologist, because that's their specialty.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
So let's talk about some tips for, we never really have enough time, but first before we go into that, I want to just shout out your website and your phone number again, because every bit of information and resource for how you can connect to experts is on that website. So I think it's important that we make sure that you have that information. So get your pens ready. Again, if you have any questions, you can call the Alzheimer's organization at 800-272-3900, or you can go to their website, which is www.alz.org. And remember, it's about changes in decisions, making decisions that don't make sense. When you can't remember where you put something and you find it in a very, very odd location. When you get lost and you can't remember how you got there. Did I get that right, Leslie?
Yes. Problem solving.
Problem solving. We'll talk more about that. But we do have to take a quick break. So stay with me, and when we come back, we'll talk more about problem solving. We'll talk more about some medications that are out there on the market and tips for caregivers, which I think is very, very important. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Jean Pete, and I welcome you back to our show, Better Living. Better Living is brought to you by the Homestead Hope Foundation and is sponsored by Homestead Hospice, where commitment to education and premier hospice care helps patients and families through life's most important journey. Thanks for staying with me. I'm still Jean Pete, and I'm still here with Leslie Gregory, who is the president, CEO of the Georgia chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. And in the first half hour, we gave an overview of what dementia is and what an Alzheimer's diagnosis is versus the big umbrella of dementia that includes many different types of dementia diagnoses. We also talked about the length of this disease. It can be anywhere from 7 to 12 or more or less, depending on the individual, and just how individualized a person's journey is when they are given a diagnosis under the dementia umbrella. So how hard it is to tell you a guide for how long each phase would be if you or a loved one is recently diagnosed with this disease. But we did give you some contact information, and a wonderful website to go to if you have questions is www.alz.org. But in this second half hour, I want to talk more about tips for caregivers and strategies, even if you're someone who has been given a recent diagnosis. We can't really talk about this anymore without talking about Glenn Campbell and all of that is brought. I saw that documentary and it really touched my heart, so I want to touch on that a little bit, how helpful that is as a caregiver and what that's doing, I imagine you agree, to help people who are on this same journey as Glenn Campbell and his wife. So let's talk about some tips for a caregiver who has a loved one who is recently diagnosed with this disease.
Well, one of the things the Alzheimer's Association does is we really help and support the caregivers as well as the person who has the disease, because this disease is unlike any other in the sense that the person who has Alzheimer's is eventually going to need 24/7 care. And many times that is provided by a family member, a loved one, not a professional caregiver, but someone in the home. Someone who might not have the training in providing that level of care. And it takes a significant toll on that person. Mm-hmm. It takes a physical toll, it takes a mental and emotional toll. So for that reason, we have services to help that caregiver as well. We have support groups, we have educational classes, we have meetings where people who are caregivers get together and interact socially, because if you're going through this disease, the people around you, if you're a caregiver for someone who is, the people around you might not really understand how difficult this is and how trying it is. And in a lot of cases, in the early stages, the caregiver may still be in the workforce. And we've seen that this disease has dramatic impact, not just on the person, but on the organization that they work with as well, because people who are caregivers report that they often have to miss work, that they might have to scale back to fewer hours, that they might be really distracted in what they're doing because it is so all-consuming. So even if you think, oh, I'm not directly impacted by this disease, the reality is you probably are. Mm-hmm. You just might not be aware of it.
And lack of sleep, because a lot of times days and nights get mixed up when the person is suffering from a dementia diagnosis, and that affects the caregiver.
They do.
And trying to keep going on a regular routine is near impossible.
Yes. And one thing we know is that 70% of people who have this disease will wander. And sometimes they wander in the night. So the caregiver, if they don't feel like they have their home set up safely so that they would know, the caregiver is often up and down all night, making sure their loved one is safe and that they don't get out and they don't wander. Because that is that puts a person at significant risk.
Oh, I don't even think of that. Let's talk about some things that are helpful for caregivers. If they do have somebody who's up at night, if they're worried about somebody wandering, they can't sleep at night. What are some tools, what are some things that they can do in their home to help make them have peace of mind so they at least can sleep?
Sure. As I said, 70% of the people who have it will wander. So this is something that we deal with at the association literally on a daily basis. We have ways that we can help people prevent wandering. We can help them with techniques, perhaps setting up an alarm on the door. There are ways that you can disguise the door so it doesn't look like a door. Different things you can do so that your loved one won't approach the door. For example, when they're further on in the disease, people might have trouble distinguishing water from a regular surface. So sometimes we'll find if people put a black mat in front of a door, their loved one won't walk under that because they don't see that as being a solid surface. Okay. So they won't walk across that. So there are lots of different strategies and tips we can give people, but one of the single most important is to get your loved one enrolled in Medic Alert Safe Return. Okay. And that's a program where you enroll your loved one then has a bracelet, a Medic Alert bracelet, so if they wander, Whoever finds them can call the number and get them back in touch with their loved ones. And there's also a bracelet that's available for caregivers. And let me tell you why that's important. Let's say you're a caregiver for your husband who has dementia. You leave for 15 minutes to run up to the drugstore, and you're involved in a car accident, and you can't speak. This bracelet will now tell the emergency responders that you're a caregiver and that they need to send someone over to your home to take care of your
Wow, that's
loved one.
important, and you don't think about that.
Yes. So Medical Alert Safe Return is really, really critical.
Now, is it a certain kind of bracelet? Because I would imagine people try to take it off.
Yes. It's a Medical Alert bracelet like you'd have for other conditions, and they can't get it off.
Okay.
So it's just really, really important. And as I said, we can also help them with strategies to prevent wandering.
Okay.
And in some cases, it may get to the point that it's just no longer safe for the loved one to be in the home.
Yes.
If there's nothing that the caregiver can do to keep them from wandering, then the best decision might be placement of their loved one in a place
that's gut-wrenching
where they know they can be safe.
I know. And I want to talk about that because that's the hardest in my experience in home health and in hospice, and heck, even before that, just with family members that I knew went through this when I was working in the financial industry. So regardless of what industry you work at, you promise, I'm going to keep you home. Most people do. I'm not going to let you go to a facility. But we lived this in my family, and I was afraid she was going to burn her house down, turning the burners on and forgetting to turn them off, and there's nothing on the stove. And at some point, you have to not feel guilty about having to make that decision, because the safety of your loved one is far more important. And yourself. You're not going to do them any good fighting for them and advocating for them and checking on them and making sure they're okay, even when they're placed in a facility, if you're not around to be their eyes and ears. So please, I feel so, my heart breaks for caregivers in this, who are taking care of someone who has this diagnosis, because oftentimes they're just so guilt-ridden that they couldn't do it on their own. And I want to lift that guilt for anyone who is at that phase and just at their wits' end and doesn't feel like they have the right to make that choice for the loved one. You do have the right to make the choice for that loved one, because your loved one needs to be safe and your loved one wants you to live. And oftentimes in our healthcare industry, we see the caregiver ends up passing before the person with dementia because they've literally drove themselves into the ground. They didn't take care of themselves.
You're exactly right. And I'm seeing this right now with someone who's very close to me. She's struggling with this exact decision. And what I tell her is, this is the kindest, most loving decision you can make.
It is.
It is, because it ensures the safety of your loved one. And as you said, the guilt it's very real. The guilt is very real, and it can be overwhelming. But imagine how much greater the guilt would be if you didn't make that decision and your loved one burned the house down and perished in a fire, or wandered and didn't come home alive. We certainly don't minimize how hard that decision is, and we can help caregivers, give them some tips and techniques on how to make that decision and how to get through that decision. We're there to help caregivers with just things like that. But what I would say is, put your loved one's safety first, and think of your own health as well.
Absolutely. And brings me to the whole Glenn Campbell situation, because when this first came out and his beautiful song, I'm Not Gonna Miss You, came out, it was heart-wrenching for me because I knew what he had coming in his journey. But I also was a little trepidatious because I thought, okay, I don't want this to give people who might not have the means that maybe his wife, and he has a false sense of, I'm not doing as much as I can for my loved one because maybe she was able to keep him at home or whatever, hiring full-time caregivers. And I just think there's such grace with the way that Glenn Campbell and his wife and his daughter and his children have embraced this disease. I remember seeing the documentary. I don't know if you've seen it or if folks listening have seen it, but I would encourage you to see it, because it's nail biting. You see him going on tour, and you know that he can't remember, and you know he's going to play the same song maybe 3 times. And they just embrace that. And they said, you know what, this is him, and this is him now, and we're still having a good time. He can still get out there and do that. Maybe it's not the same as it used to be, but they embraced that change. I loved that. But secondly, and most importantly, he's now in a facility. And I applaud his wife for making that decision and talking about that journey and how he's safe and she visits him. And I'm just so glad, because I don't want anybody to think that that's not the right decision to make. And I think that hopefully that's helpful for other people who are going through this journey as well.
Sure, and I think it's important to know that you can't judge what's right for your loved one based on what's right for someone else's loved one. So you can't really look at someone else's situation and say, oh, that's how I should be doing this.
Right.
Because it just doesn't necessarily apply to your loved one. Your situation is unique to you and your loved one who's going through this. And I'd like to point out 2 things about what you said that are so important. Number one is things like this Glenn Campbell documentary are just critical because they're shining a light on this disease. For so long, we didn't talk about this disease. There was a stigma attached to it, and in some ways there still is. But I think as a whole, we're getting past that, and we're realizing this is a progressive disease of the brain that we need to be talking about, thinking about, and trying to find a cure for. So when something like this does come out, it helps people realize, hey, I'm not in this alone.
Right.
Other people are dealing with this too. So shining that strong light on Alzheimer's, it's critical. And another thing that you mentioned that I think is so important, you were talking about how early on he was still going on tours and that kind of thing, and they were just saying, this is who he is today. One of our messages that we try to give people is a message of hope, because you can live your best with Alzheimer's disease. You absolutely can. And I've seen that up close and personal. One of our best volunteers tells a story of the day she got the diagnosis. She went home, she crawled in bed, pulled the covers over her head, and she didn't leave for 3 months. She was so depressed, she thought her life was over. And then she realized, no, this is who I am now. This is my life. I've got to find a way to live with this. And now she is one of our most active volunteers. She comes into our office and participates in a program called Time to Talk. She gets on the phone, she calls other people in the early stages of the disease and supports them and talks through things that only people with the disease can understand. She goes with us to Washington, D.C. to lobby our legislators for more funding. Her story for a need for more research is so powerful. She's one of our best advocates. She talks to the media for us. So she has found this sense of purpose in this point in her life that keeps her going. And it's just so amazing for me to see this, for me to see how she has embraced her life and who she is now. And that's what we want everyone to do, because you still can live your best, even with the diagnosis.
And that's what I took away from watching that. It was hard. I felt more hard for the wife, honestly. But I love the way the family just let it be. It's okay if it's different. It's okay if he's not perfect. We're going to kind of find the humor in this and just love that he's still doing what he loves to do. So for as long as he can, let's go with it in all that imperfection that's happening right now. And that's what I want to leave with everybody listening. It's okay for your loved one to be imperfect. And people are going to take your lead on how to react when they are imperfect. And I loved the grace of which Glenn Campbell's family embraced that imperfection.
Yes, and that's one thing we tell people is your loved one can no longer come into your world. So it's your responsibility to step into your loved one's world. And one thing that does is it takes some of the stress off. And the person who's less stressed is going to be able to function better. So it's better for the person who has the disease, and frankly, it's better for you as a caregiver not to have the same expectations that you had before. So, constantly asking, Dad, don't you remember me? Don't you know who I am? That's not necessarily the way to do it. That's not the best way to go about this. Just accept where they are on any given day. It may be different tomorrow, but just accept where the person is today.
It's just great. I'm just obviously very touched by their publicity around what they're going through. And I hope that it helps for a future for Alzheimer's research, dementia research, and awareness. Okay, so let's talk about, we talked about some tips for the caregiver. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on there before we talk maybe about some local events and what have you?
The main thing I would say is you're not in this alone. So many families, they get the diagnosis, they get a prescription for Aricept or Namenda, and the doctor says, come back and see me in 6 months, and they're lost. They're confused. They've got this what now question burning in their mind. Yeah. And what I would say is you are not alone. Call us. We can help you. We have information and referral service that you don't have to do any of the work. We've done it all for you. We can give you tips and guidance and support on getting through this. So that would be the most important thing, is reach out to your local Alzheimer's Association. You are not in this battle alone. Let's
talk about some ways that a caregiver in the early mid stages can help keep their loved one at home longer, even if they can't keep them home forever. Can we talk a little bit about adult daycare? Is there enough of those now? Is that a growing trend, or is that not really? There's just not enough resources right now.
And I think that's always been the case. There aren't enough resources. There might not be enough resources for people who want to keep their loved one at home and have in-home resources to support them. And that's always been the challenge, is getting those kinds of things funded, just as we're struggling with getting enough funding for research. Mm-hmm. So the best thing to do is just reach out, and we can tell you where the resources are.
Okay.
We can help you find them.
Because I know there was a lack of availability for somewhere just for the day. There's just not enough of it going on, and it doesn't seem like we've made a lot of strides there in the last couple of years.
And there's need for respite services as well. Right. There are some resources out there, but there aren't enough. But that is something that's very important, is respite for the caregiver.
Okay. Is there anything, we're here in Atlanta, is there anything that folks need to know about that's upcoming here in Atlanta, or ways they can help?
Absolutely. It's important to note that all the services that the association provides to family are free of charge. We never charge family members for our services, and the only way we can do that is through the kind and generous support of the public. And this community, the Georgia community, has come together so strongly really to help people with Alzheimer's disease. And one of the best ways they can do that is through our Walk to End Alzheimer's. And those are happening all across the country this fall. We have them all across the state of Georgia. We have the Atlanta Walk here on September 26th. We have an Athens Walk on October 24th. And again, we have them literally all across the state. And all you have to do, we have 16 of them, and all you have to do is go onto our website and click, and you can see a list of all the dates, all the locations. We'd love to see you out there. This is a great event for raising money. It's also a great event for raising awareness and for getting people to talk about this disease. So please come out and see us. There's a walk near you. Please come out.
And even meeting other people that are going through the same thing as you. If you don't want to go to a support group, well, this is just a great way to be social, be active, and meet like people that might help you find your own support.
Absolutely. And going to a walk is just a way to get inspired. When you go and you see all the families that are there rallying around, they may come in honor or memory of a loved one, or they may have their loved one with them. And that's just such a powerful thing to see.
And it's a great lesson for your children. It's just there's so many benefits to participating in a walk. And remember, folks, it's scary. 1 in 2 of us, if we reach the age of 85, are going to get Alzheimer's. It's statistically shown. That's so scary to me.
It is scary. It is frightening. And in fact, it's the one thing that worries me most in life. I have it in my family. My husband has it in his family. So it's very real for us.
Let's talk about that, because it is hereditary. But 1 in 2, basically that means everybody has it in their family.
Yes. What we tell people is, if you have a brain, you are at risk. And that's the bottom line. You are. It doesn't discriminate. It stretches across all races, both sexes. We know women are slightly more affected than men.
Are they?
And they're also more likely to be caregivers.
Well, but they live longer, so
yeah. So women are hit hard, and as being caregivers, we're more likely to be 24/7 caregivers. But the reality is, it can affect anyone and everyone. No one's immune.
Do you think I just wonder if we live in that chaotic brain overload world, are we harming our brain? You know, maybe meditation and balance. I don't know. Is there anything out there you can offer us to say this is good for you? This may help even if you get it, but maybe it'll come up later. I don't know. I'm just thinking.
Yes. I think those main things, exercising, eating a good healthy diet, a good heart healthy diet, managing your numbers, being mentally, physically, socially active. And we tell people exercise your brains, learn something new, learn how to ballroom dance, learn how to play a musical instrument. Don't just sit passively on the sofa and flip through the channels on the television. Get out and do something and use your brain.
That's true, because as you're challenging yourself to do things that are not routine, I'm visualizing, you know, different connections in the brain, I guess, becoming alive that maybe weren't used. And so that just helps keep the brain functioning.
And there are some studies that show that if you have a greater kind of cognitive reserve, maybe your symptoms won't progress as quickly. So, you know, the more you can learn, the more you can use your brain. That's important.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Well, before we go, thank you so much, Leslie, for being with us. Very important information. And again, I'm going to give you that 800 number and that website. It's 800-272-3900. And the website's www.alz.org. Please, if you have any concerns about yourself or a loved one, make an appointment today. The sooner the better, so you can get your affairs in order, you can get the medications to help hold the disease at bay, and you can live your best life. Anything else before we go, Leslie?
Just that we would like for people to become involved with the association. We'd love to have you as a volunteer, as an advocate. We need more voices, and as a supporter. There's a place for you at the Alzheimer's Association.
I love the whole volunteer idea, because even if you're a caregiver, what you can offer for all of these caregivers who are so afraid of the journey ahead of them is priceless. And you get what you give. You get back so much more. So please do reach out and volunteer if you can. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Jeannie Pete. Thanks for listening. Have a blessed day and week ahead. And listen here, same time next week and every week. Homestead Hope Foundation is your resource for a healthy life. God bless.